Welcome back to the show. Well, November marked 3 years since the uprising in Ukraine. 3 years since people took it to Maidan Square demanding closer ties with the EU and especially an end to corruption in the country. 3 years on, and the Ukraine is embroiled in a bitter conflict in the east, and the cries of corruption are as loud as ever. Well, with us for this half of the show, we're joined by former Prime Minister to Ukraine, Mr. Arseny Yatseniuk. You took power just after those protests and remained there until April of this year when you decided enough was enough and again resigned amid cries of corruption. Welcome to the show. Now, you're visiting here the EU institutions, meeting with a number of commissioners and indeed the President of the European Parliament. What's all that about, given that you're no longer Prime Minister?
You started our conversation with the history of Ukrainian uprising. And I have to comment on this. For the first time in the European history, in the modern European history, Ukrainian people, waving the EU flags, fought for their independence, democracy and freedoms. We faced tremendous challenges. After the revolution, Russian Federation illegally annexed Crimea. After the revolution, Russia sent its proxy and guerrillas to Donetsk and Lugansk and seized part of my territory. Go ahead.
No, but I'm just, because we will definitely get to Crimea in a minute.
People don't know this, okay?
Oh, I think Crimea is pretty well covered.
Let's raise this issue once again.
Is that what the visit here to Brussels is this week?
The visit was more focused on DCFTA. This is Deep Comprehensive Free Trade Area and visa-free regime for the Ukrainians, because we did our part of job. We passed the legislation which is necessary. We entirely overhaul homeland security system in Ukraine. We put a number of migration restrictions. We put a number of important steps to improve security in my country, and we met all criteria.
So why is the EU stalling, in your opinion?
Well, sometimes it happens. Red tape and bureaucracy, even in the European Union.
But at the same time, the EU has been stalling on this issue of visa-free travel for Ukrainians. Also, this association agreement, which would increase trade between Ukraine and the EU, has not been ratified by the Netherlands. And it looks like Prime Minister Mark Rutte is really struggling to pass that. It looks like there's still a lot of countries in the EU that don't want closer ties with Ukraine.
Let's put it this way. Once again, let's start with the free regime. The European Commission and the European Parliament already confirmed that Ukraine met all criteria to get visa-free regime. What's happening right now in Brussels? There is a different wording and different language of the legislation of so-called suspension mechanism. And France knows what am I talking about, and the French government.
The people watching, maybe? Go on, explain. For those who don't know, or those who are watching.
The suspension mechanism means that in case if some group of people violate it or misuse visa-free regime, the suspension on entire regime for the entire country could be implemented. And there is a difference, there is a huge difference between the approach the Parliament has and the executive has. So they need to find the compromise. And after the meeting with President Schulz, he was very clear, saying that there is an overwhelming majority in the Parliament to pass this decision.
Because one of the main demands of Maidan Square protesters was closer ties with the EU.
True.
Do you think that that is happening and will happen?
And this is the basic principle of the European Union, freedom of movement. I know this is very unpopular in some member states.
Increasingly so.
Absolutely, but this is the wrong approach. If you follow demagogues and populists, you're gonna lose. Stay and stick to your convictions and to your values. Never give up. Tell the truth to your people, like I told the truth to my people, even despite the fact that this truth was very unpopular. We had to pass austerity packages, we had to increase taxes, we had to spend 5% as a military expenditures. We had to undertake very unpopular steps to save the country, and we did it.
Well, actually, indeed, when you look at the east of the country, is still, in bitter conflict, and these Minsk agreement talks seem to be going nowhere. Each side blaming the other, Ukraine blaming Russia, Russia blaming the Ukraine. At some point, somebody's going to have to take a step forward, surely, for the people in the east.
You said Ukrainians and Russians are not willing to move. This is not true. The truth is Ukraine is a victim. The truth is Russia illegally annexed Crimea. The truth is Russia sent its military, tanks, artillery to the Ukrainian territory.
Is Kiev ready to hold local elections in the east? Because that's a big part.
Okay. The truth is that we signed the Minsk deal. Under the Minsk deal, Ukraine passed the constitutional amendments in the first reading, passed an amnesty bill, passed the bill on the special status of Donetsk and Lugansk. And the House passed a special resolution which actually defined the touchline of this so-called special area. We did our job. What is the Minsk deal about? Because everyone is deliberating over the Minsk. What does it mean? So let me put it in a very simple terms. Minsk means, first of all, that there will be an ongoing full-fledged ceasefire on the ground. Russian forces and Russian proxies still kill Ukrainian soldiers. This is the truth. This is the fact in our post-factual world, because no one cares about the facts.
Well, one thing the EU did do after Russia annexed Crimea was slap sanctions on Russia. A lot of EU countries had been lukewarm about those sanctions anyway. They're to be renewed at the end of January, when we'll have a new president in the White House across in the United States, Donald Trump, and he's definitely more pro-Russian than his predecessor, and he wants to end these sanctions. How confident are you that they will continue?
I am fully confident that sanctions will be rolled over. These sanctions is not only about Ukraine. These sanctions about the values of the European Union. Russian Federation, for the first time after the Second World War, just draw the new lines in Europe. They grab a part of independent country. They send their military. They are constantly violating an international law. So the EU and the US have to be strong in imposing sanctions and punishing Russia. Russia posed the threat not only to Ukraine. That's true that the Ukrainian military is the only military in the world who is fighting against the Russian forces. We defend your borders. We defend the borders of the European Union and of NATO member states. It's in your interests too.
Another of the Maidan demands was an end to corruption in the country. You were Prime Minister for over 2 years. How many corrupt politicians, corrupt businessmen were actually brought to justice?
We passed an impressive legislation that established new independent anti-corruption bureau, new independent anti-corruption agency. A special anti-corruption prosecutor was appointed. The parliament passed a sweeping judicial reform, and the new Chief Justice and the new Supreme Court will be in place in 2 months. And one of the most important steps that my government did, we passed the regulation for all public officials and elected officials that oblige them to fill in so-called e-declaration, electronic declaration. Just to put it in simple words, for example, the president or member of Congress or
public
the
officials
governor
in general.
All public officials, both elected and appointed, they have to present to the Ukrainian people an entire declaration of both revenues, expenditures, tangible and intangible property, the property, revenues and expenditures of related parties like relatives. There is no any kind of declaration in the world. So I believe that, for example, France will take Ukrainian example, and your politicians will disclose all assets.
You think they will? Maybe they should, but we'll see if they will.
We hope so.
Well, actually, we're going to take a closer look at that e-declaration that was put in place, somewhat under pressure as well from the EU, to get public officials in Ukraine under pressure, it has to be said, from the EU, among others. The idea was to show exactly where their money and assets came from, to see if any had been made illegally. However, the amount of cash that politicians there had came as quite a surprise to many Ukrainians, for whom the average salary is €400 a month. Our reporter Gallagher Cragg sends us this.
Officially, members of Ukraine's parliament earn €600 a month. So when a new law forced them to publish online asset declarations, eyebrows were raised at the wealth on display.
Yes, I'm a rich man. I was in business when I became an MP. I sold my assets for around $5 million, and I've got about 15% of that left.
Ukrainian MPs are widely suspected of using their positions to enrich themselves. One of the president's main allies, Ihor Kononenko, has been accused of coordinating corruption schemes. He declared €2 million in cash, several expensive properties, and 7 Swiss watches. The transparency bill only passed at the 5th attempt, amid resistance from MPs such as Tatiana Donets. While Donets and Kononenko declared various business interests, others' wealth is wholly unaccounted for. 27-year-old Andriy Lozovi declared 4 Swiss watches, €200,000 in cash, an art collection, and no income other than his salary. Altogether, even just the money MPs hold privately in cash adds up to nearly a quarter of Ukraine's defence budget. Meanwhile, vans like this one ply the countryside as volunteers collect donations for soldiers in the war-torn east, still cold and poorly fed. Villagers here responded eagerly to the call for help, but they're also bitter.
I'm lost for words. I give all I possibly can, and those rich politicians can't even spare 5 hryvnias.
They should be handcuffed and sent to Siberia. They stole so much, and they won't even finance the army properly.
It does appear, Mr. Yatseniuk, that the very rich rule Ukraine. Do you think that's normal?
Ukraine is not ruled by the rich. Ukraine is ruled by the Ukrainian people, and that's the reason why former President Yanukovych fled the country. Look, Ukraine is a democratic state. Ukraine had 3 consecutive elections. Ukrainian parliament passed a sweeping legislation that obliged all Ukrainian public officials to disclose their assets. So Ukraine is ruled by the Ukrainian people. And this is the fact once again.
Do you think President Petro Poroshenko is honest? Is he one of the non-corrupt politicians? I mean, you failed to work with him when you were Prime Minister. You had to step down.
Look, there was a political culture in Ukraine previously. When someone loses the post, then he goes to Brussels or to DC or to Paris and starts to criticize the president or the new prime minister. Not in my case. Look, we are frenemies with my president, that's true, okay? But for the sake of the country, I decided to step down. I decided to grab the votes for the new prime minister, to put him in the office. And I decided to support the agenda of the president in case if the president pursues the reform agenda.
And if you had said he wouldn't have pursued this reform agenda?
Well, my faction is the second biggest one and most disciplined. So once again, it's not about the president, it's about the future of the Ukrainian people. We need to implement reforms. That's what we are doing.
Well, just before the anniversary, the 3-year anniversary, we saw the governor of one of Ukraine's largest regions, Odessa, step down, and Mikhail Saakashvili saying he couldn't possibly remain in the position because Kiev was sabotaging all kinds of reform, that the politicians in power still don't want an end to corruption.
That's another political trick. If you can deliver, you always quit and say, look, I was out of powers. I wanted to change the country. I wanted to give you everything you deserve for, but I failed. Look, in my country we have demagogues and political clowns too.
But isn't there a willingness to work together? I mean, Odessa, a major region in the Ukraine.
Going back to the question you just raised, once again, you had the office of the governor. You had all powers. You had your folks appointed as the Homeland Security Secretary in the region, as the prosecutor, as the chief of the IRS in the region. You had everything to deliver. You failed.
But Saakashvili, when you were Prime Minister, said you were also part of the problem because you postponed privatizing a massive chemical plant in the region because, again, wanting to keep the systems in place that allow people to gain extra money, perhaps in a backhanded way.
I want to be very clear once again. The person was appointed. He had all powers to deliver changes. He failed. Then he is seeking for his political future. He's not thinking about the future of my country. He's thinking about his political future. which I don't care about.
Do you think there's a new revolution brewing in Ukraine?
No. What I think, a new evolution is brewing in Ukraine. Evolution is true. And it takes time. Always it takes time for changes.
Okay.
It's not an easy job.
Do you think the people in Ukraine are happy with the government? Because surveys show that they're really not very impressed with how things have gone since their uprising.
Did you follow the polls for the US elections? Or did you follow the polls for Brexit?
At the same time, it's public opinion.
Yeah,
You think most people in Ukraine support the government?
What I am absolutely sure about, after 4 austerity packages, could you imagine, for example, if your government passed 4 austerity packages in France, what's going to happen with your government and your president? If you increase taxes, what's going to happen with you? If you increase household tariffs by 10 times, what's going to happen with the government? That's normal that people are unhappy with the government. This is the destiny of every politician. But the destiny of every statesman is to deliver and never give up.
Okay, well, it's on that note, Mr. Arseny Yatseniuk. We're going to have to leave it. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks also, of course, to you at home for having watched. That brings us to the end of this edition of Talking Europe.